Chapter 5. Christianity versus Social Entropy. Quote, Man, being in rebellion against law and causality as infringements on his becoming and on his ultimacy in process, evolution, Gary North, must therefore be also in rebellion against clock time as the epitome of his slavery. Clock time is a bondage whose ticking always and monotonously moves in terms of an eternal decree external to and transcending man. Man's rebellion against eternity, therefore, must be followed by a rebellion against time. Time always beats to and echoes the stroke of eternity. Thus, the rejection of God inevitably requires as its logical concomitant the rejection of time. Man seeks to arrest time, as from the days of the Tower of Babel to Hitler's 1,000-year Reich and the United Nations by his own decree, or to flee from time by the clock from history into mysticism, time lived. In either case, man as God is saying, time shall be no more. End quote. R.J. Rushdoony. All parties to the debate understand the appeal of optimism. The scientific creationists, because they are Christians, offer the hope of individual salvation to man. The premillennialists, implicitly, though never explicitly, offer the hope of partially overcoming entropy during Christ's millennial reign. The amillennialists offer hope at least beyond the grave, though not before. Post-millennialists alone are the Christian theologians of hope for history. Rifkin has no true eschatological hope to offer. He is a believer in evolution, and he is also a believer in the entropy law. He claims that the universe is running down to the timeless oblivion of heat death. Nevertheless, only Bertrand Russell and a few hardcore evolutionists have fearlessly discussed the grim implications of this pessimistic claim. Thus, Rifkin adopts a very clever tactic to promote optimism by means of a system which guarantees mankind the ultimate defeat of meaninglessness, impotence, and death. To this extent, Rifkin is epistemologically schizophrenic. He cannot decide whether to adopt Western entropy-based pessimism or the escapist bliss of anti-rational, anti-scientific Eastern mysticism. False optimism. Rifkin's language is unquestionably religious in tone. Quote, This book is about hope, the hope that comes from shattering false illusions and replacing them with new truths. End quote. But where is this hope? In what does it consist? The sober analysis of Bertrand Russell was more honest. Quote, The same laws which produce growth also produce decay. Someday the sun will grow cold and life on the earth will cease. The whole epoch of animals and plants is only an interlude between ages that were too hot and ages that will be too cold. There is no law of cosmic progress, but only an oscillation upward and downward, with a slow trend downward on the balance owing to the diffusion of energy. This, at least, is what science at present regards as most probable, and in our disillusioned generation, it is easy to believe. From evolution, so far as our present knowledge shows, no ultimately optimistic philosophy can be validly inferred. End quote. Russell's viewpoint is consistent. Its innate pessimism is straightforward. Whenever we encounter a philosophy that emphasizes the entropy process, we will find a dead end at the end of history, ultimately the destruction of history. The universe grows cold. All directional movement ceases. There is no way to measure change over time because there is no longer any non-random change to measure, nor any living being to measure it. The concept of time itself becomes meaningless. Time ends. Intellectual schizophrenia. Rifkin's book evades the obvious implications of his entropy process. He cannot decide which philosophy he wishes his readers to accept, static Eastern mysticism or Western materialism. Western materialism acknowledges the reality of science, and therefore the reality of the second law of thermodynamics. Eastern mysticism, in the final analysis, denies the reality of matter. Matter is maya, an illusion. Meaning is found only in metaphysical union with God. Such a God is totally beyond matter, and therefore is unable to affect history. God is the monistic, impersonal one. the undifferentiated being into which all being is absorbed. Life is swallowed up in changeless, meaningless, undifferentiated oneness. In such a cosmology, the second law of thermodynamics is ultimately irrelevant to anything, as are history, ethics, death, and everything else. It is only within this matter-denying cosmology that the quote-unquote higher consciousness techniques of Eastern mysticism are personally relevant. That is, materially irrelevant. Rifkin proclaims both 1. Eastern mysticism with its promise of escape from meaningless matter and history into meaningless union with the One, and 2. Western science with its promise of ultimate meaninglessness and timelessness when the entropy process has run its course. But what is even more astounding, he proclaims this fusion or confusion of cosmologies in the name of hope. He thinks this philosophy will provide hope for the world in terms of the processes of the material world. A new worldview? Rifkin is convinced that this philosophy is about to sweep over Western civilization. Quote, "For our grandchildren's generation, the entropic worldview will be like second nature. They will not think about it. They will merely live by it, unconscious of its hold over them, as we have for so long been unconscious of the hold Newtonian mechanics has had over us. Already, the outline of the new entropy paradigm is being filled in by scholars around the world. Within a few years, every academic discipline will be turned inside out by the new entropy conception." End quote. He believes that this new philosophy will lead to the reconstruction of Western culture. He sees only 3 possible responses to this philosophy. First, quote, "After finishing this book, some will remain unconvinced that there are physical limits that place restraints on human action in the world." End quote. This is overstating the case. Almost everyone in the modern secularized Darwinian West knows that there are limits in this world. Quote, "Man, the purposeful master of evolution," end quote, cannot forever succeed in his battle against the effects of entropy. The debate centers over the time framework. The question raised by modern science is simply, how long, O Lord of Entropy, how long? Second, Rifkin goes on, quote, "Others will be convinced, but will conclude with despair that the entropy law is a giant cosmic prison from which there is no escape." End quote. Third, he writes, quote, "Finally, there will be those who will see the entropy law as the truth that can set us free. The first group will continue to uphold the existing world paradigm. The second group will be without a worldview. The third group will be the harbingers of the new age." End quote. This is unmistakably a religious appeal. He is the herald of a quote-unquote new age. The new age philosophy is mystical and frequently occult. There are many promoters of variants of this philosophy, but quote-unquote higher consciousness is certainly a universal New Age theme. It is the call to self-transcendence, a kind of metaphysical leap of being. It is not a call to ethical regeneration. Rifkin's mystical social entropy theory leaves unanswered some obvious questions. He writes as though he does not want men to despair, as Bertrand Russell despaired. But how do his answers leave man with legitimate hope concerning his cosmic condition? Supposedly, man has hope in a coming metaphysical union with a monistic God. But what does this have to do with a systematic social theory based on insights from the second law of thermodynamics? Nothing. Furthermore, how will man, who is presently physical and who, Rifkin claims, exists in terms of a universal law of physical entropy, be able to survive the entropic death of the universe when this monistic God is indistinguishable from the universe? How can this pantheistic God survive entropy's death-dealing blow any more than man can survive, or the cosmos can survive? A God of this world dies when this world dies. Stalemate religion. Rifkin is a man without legitimate hope. His proposed utopian static society, even if it could somehow be achieved, and Rifkin offers no program for achieving it, it is not a society that offers hope. Such a zero-growth society is the antithesis of the God-blessed society of Deuteronomy 28, 1-14. Rifkin has accepted the false premise that our universe is an ethically closed box, that there is no creator above, no week of creation behind, no sustaining providence underneath, no resurrection of Christ, no long-run material progress in the future, and no escape from entropy. Why do men believe such ideas? Because they refuse to acknowledge the historical fact of the ethical rebellion of Adam in time and on earth. They therefore deny the inescapable result of this event, a final judgment in the future. Social entropy's remedy is useless in the long run. Rifkin proclaims a zero-growth philosophy as a solution for an entropy-bound world. He proclaims a status quo economics in a dissipating, disintegrating universe. The status quo can never be maintained. There is no status quo in history. History progresses chronologically toward a final resolution. The ethical warfare which characterizes history continues. This warfare is not static. There are victors and losers, civilization by civilization. These battles have consequences for the external world. What we must reject is the myth of the status quo. This myth is for history what the myth of neutrality is for philosophy. The source of both myths is the same: Satan. Satan is involved in a titanic struggle against God. It is an ethical struggle. He proclaims a rival world and life view. Numerous views, in fact, but all premised on a rejection of the creator-creature distinction. He promotes ethical rebellion in the name of neutrality. He promotes his temporal victory in the name of the status quo. He calls for a stalemate. Just give him the territory he already possesses. Just give him the neutral quote-unquote laws of nature by which to operate his kingdom. Just give him limited autonomy. That is really all he asks. God only needs to deny a little of his own sovereignty. This was Pharaoh's underlying argument to Moses against the quote-unquote unreasonable demands of the God of Israel. It was Satan's underlying argument to Eve. It is an argument that denies the being and character of God. Satan cannot achieve a stalemate. He is headed for external defeat. He has already experienced definitive defeat at Calvary. He can only look forward to final defeat on Judgment Day. Meanwhile, he is experiencing progressive defeat in history. He wins battles. He will not win the war. His followers win battles. They will not win the war. Herbert Schlossberg is correct. Quote, "The Bible can be interpreted as a string of God's triumphs disguised as disasters." End quote. The cross is the best example. Christ's death, which was followed by his resurrection. On the day of judgment, no prisoners will be taken. What Israel was told by God to do to the Canaanites, so will God do to all those who have rebelled and who have not repented. There can be no stalemate. Christians must abandon the stalemate mentality. Zero growth is one aspect of the stalemate religion. It offers mankind no hope, for in a world governed by entropy there can be no stalemate. Entropy is a sure winner in the closed-box universe of humanism. Stalemate is a myth here, too. Mankind will lose to the forces of cosmic heat death. Even the increase of entropy must end when the final dissipation of energy has taken place. History is bounded even for the humanists, from the Big Bang origin to the final dissipation of energy. While scientists seek frantically to locate sufficient mass in the universe to make theoretically plausible endless cycles of expansion and contraction, they have not found this much-needed matter. History is linear, and it leads to the death of man. And even a cyclical universe will guarantee the death of man, for the universe will be crushed into a point, or even a vanishing point, that might produce the next Big Bang. Humanist science can offer only extinction to man. To that degree, humanist science is demonic. The death of man is Satan's goal. His religion of stalemate teaches ultimate defeat for man, the image of God. Satan would prefer this sort of universal defeat for all mankind to the victory of God's people over Satan's followers. Better the death of all men than the triumph of God's men. 3. Biblical optimism, progressive sanctification. Rifkin does not want Western humanist man's theology of power. He also does not want Western man's vision of ultimate defeat in the heat death of the universe. He proclaims a third way: the monistic absorption of man in mystical escape from the realm of matter. What Rifkin ignores is a fourth possible response to his book, a self-consciously biblical response. The Christian accepts the reality of a time-bound, sin-filled, and God-cursed universe. He understands that God's curse is also a blessing for mankind, for economic scarcity makes profitable voluntary human cooperation. The Christian also argues that various degradative processes are governed by man's ethical response to the gospel of Jesus Christ. When men respond in obedient faith to God, God lifts many aspects of the curse. He promises even to extend drastically the average lifetime of mankind. Isaiah 65:20. In short, ethics is primary, not some entropy process. The tendency of all things to wear out is progressively overcome, just as surely as miracles reverse this tendency. Thus, degradative processes are not uniformitarian sentences of doom. They are covenantal curses that can be, and have often been, reversed in human history. The Christian can therefore accept and promote some of the scientific conclusions of the present scientific world and life view to the extent that this view is future-oriented, rational, and based on the concept of cause and effect. The Christian believes in the possibility of ethics-based dominion, for God promises to bless covenant-keeping man and to remove his curse progressively if men obey him. Covenant-keeping man does not seek power as a religious impulse. He seeks first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things, including power, are then given to him. Matthew 6:33. The Christian must not accept Darwinism, or pure materialism, or the idea of the autonomous progress of man, but he can accept the basic optimism of the Western view of man, for this Western view was originally Christian. That this cursed world has a temporal end is specifically a Christian idea. In fact, its end can be expected several billion years before evolutionists expect the sun to flame out or explode in a nova. But the end of this world is not the end of the world in the Christian worldview, unlike the pessimism of the entropists' view. Christians must reject the conclusion of the social entropists, namely, that because this present age is governed by physical entropy, man's social institutions cannot experience long-term growth. What the Christian must affirm is that there is always a possibility of long-term ethical improvement, both for individuals and collectives, voluntary associations, civil governments, cultural groups, nations, and even the whole world order. In other words, the Christian must affirm the possibility of progressive ethical sanctification. He must not limit the sanctification process to the souls of men or to the internal life of the spirit. Ethics has consequences for human action. Human action influences the external world, and the external world responds. There is a long-term relationship between ethics and cultural progress. Deuteronomy 28, 1-14. Man's economic environment, like his numbers, can continue to grow until the day of final judgment. Earthly blessings. Because the Christian knows that there is hope beyond the last-day resurrection, both for man and his environment, he can have legitimate hope concerning the world's future. We know that men's ethical decisions have heavenly consequences for both the unregenerate, Luke 12, 47-48, and the regenerate, 1 Corinthians 3:8 and 12-15. We also know that God gives regenerate men an earnest down payment on their future spiritual victory, Ephesians 1:14. How then should we regard the promises of external blessings in Deuteronomy 28, 1-14? We must see them as down payments on the future physical triumph over the curse of the creation, Romans 8, 18-23. The Christian needs to be optimistic about our present world, for this world testifies to a God who judges, and this God is the rewarder of those who diligently search for him, Hebrews 11:6. To repeat, we are to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to us, Matthew 6:33. The issue is ethics, not entropy. Victory in history is not going to be a discontinuous, unexpected event for God's people. Each Christian's victory over spiritual death at the day of resurrection is to be preceded by a partial, imperfect spiritual victory in time and on earth through personal self-discipline in terms of God's law. Similarly, victory over physical death also will not be a discontinuous event. We are told by God that we should expect health, long life, and an end to miscarriages. This is what Exodus 23, 25-26 promises. This means that we should expect a population explosion. The Christian West has experienced such events. Now, humanism threatens to overturn these blessings. Final judgment: biblical or humanistic? Christianity is not a zero-growth religion. From God's promise to fallen Eve of a future seed, Genesis 3:15, to his promise of a nation to Abraham, Genesis 15, to Christ's announcement of his total power and his instructions for his followers to disciple all nations, Matthew 28:18-19, the testimony of God is clear. We must expect growth. Growth is an ethical imperative. Zero-growth philosophy is not a neutral philosophy. It is a counsel of despair, even when wrapped in words of optimism. Such a philosophy must be rejected by Christians. They must purge from their own social analysis all traces of this philosophy. If a growing number of people should respond in faith to God's offer of salvation, and if they begin to follow God's precepts that govern every area of life, then we should expect economic development, visible progress, and long-term population growth as God's visible response to widespread covenantal faithfulness. Christians argue about the Bible's teachings concerning such a future manifestation on earth of God's kingdom by means of the preaching of the gospel. But in principle, God offers to mankind the hope of salvation, which means he offers the possibility of the transformation of man's social environment and even his biological lifespan through covenantal obedience. God offers an escape from social entropy. A spiritual battle is in progress. Our ethical warfare is not a straight-line phenomenon, either personally, as the Psalms teach us, or socially, as Deuteronomy 28:15-68 teaches us. But the historical framework in which we operate is a straight-line phenomenon, and it points to the final judgment by God, not judgment by impersonal cosmic heat death. A zero-growth philosophy ultimately is mythical. By its own terms, it points to the frozen death of energy dissipation. No Christian can adopt a zero-growth philosophy and still remain orthodox. What we find, then, is that evolutionism has a doctrine of a final judgment. This judgment is based on the postulate of entropy. The entropists proclaim a fixed order of entropy, not a fixed ethics. There is no way to reconcile social entropy with Christianity, or to reconcile science's doctrine of impersonal final judgment with Christianity's doctrine of final ethical judgment. The war between evolutionism and Christianity must not be minimized. We see the conflict between rival religions. This war manifests itself in the debate over the nature of the final judgment. As Rushduni says, quote, "The details differ, but every worldview and every faith has its version of judgment, heaven, and hell. For some, hell is existence, and heaven is nirvana and nothingness. But the basic categories remain. The relativists, nihilists, and existentialists who deny all absolute values and laws demand judgment on God, law, and morality. Hell for them is a world of absolute values, which they wage war against, and heaven is a world beyond good and evil. But to transfer final judgment, heaven and hell, from the eternal order to time is to absolutize history and to enthrone man as God. It means the destruction of liberty, because history ceases to be the realm of liberty and testing, but becomes the place of final trial. Having made the final judgment temporal, the humanist cannot permit liberty, because liberty is hostile to finality. Liberty presupposes trial and error and the possibility of serious waywardness when and where man is sinful and imperfect. History cannot tolerate both trial and error and also insist on finality and the end of trial and error. The humanistic utopias are all prisons because they insist on a finality which man does not possess. Accordingly, the socialist utopias demand the re-education of man in the post-revolutionary world, in the era beyond judgment. The quote-unquote new era is the new heaven on earth. But history refuses to terminate on man's orders because it runs on God's time and not in terms of man's myths. As a result, the final orders which men build have an inevitable habit of decay, and the order which claims to be final ensures its own destruction as the movement of history crushes it underfoot in its unrelenting march to epistemological self-consciousness. Conclusion: The appeal of optimism is a kind of, quote, uniformitarian ideological constant, end quote. Every group that seeks a large audience understands that it must offer hope. Premillennialists and amillennialists offer hope beyond the grave. Premillennialists also offer hope during the millennium, when Christ returns physically to rule in power. These are appeals beyond the declining historical present. They are appeals to discontinuity in the midst of cultural and historical despair, a despair toward history that supposedly cannot be overcome by the efforts of Christians who faithfully preach and obey the gospel, given the principles of interpretation of these two eschatological systems. What is needed is postmillennialism's vision of victory in history, not simply victory outside history. Christians need to believe that their personal efforts in history do have world-transforming effects in history, before Jesus Christ returns physically to judge men at the last day. They need the self-confidence that faith in the future brings. They need to know that God's external covenantal blessings will be showered on His church before the quote-unquote church age ends. Blessings experienced by Christians throughout the promised millennial era of peace and prosperity that the faithful preaching of the gospel by the church inevitably leads to. Christians need faith in the world-healing power of the gospel. Christ's resurrection is behind us. Satan's defeat was in principle established at Calvary. He was cast down to earth at that time. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of his testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. Revelation 12, 9-11. We now have the Holy Spirit and the law of God. What more do we need? Postmillennialism offers true earthly hope. It asks rhetorically, O Entropy, where is thy sting? Rifkin also uses the language of hope. He appeals to the hope of achieving a decent lifestyle in the midst of decline. This hope is limited to men's internal psychological lives, becoming quote-unquote one with nature, etc. But man's potential hope is offset eternally by cosmic pessimism, and immediately by social pessimism. Rifkin says that not only is the universe inescapably declining, but human society is about to decline when it runs out of resources, including the resource of a clean environment. The hope he offers is strictly temporal. He makes no legitimate appeal to a world beyond the grave, a regenerated world beyond the curse of degeneration. How can Christians challenge Rifkin's view of the present world order? How can they make a convincing challenge to his despairing view of the present drift of events? Obviously, they can appeal to a heavenly escape, internal and psychological, church membership, happy Christian family life, etc., and also a discontinuous miraculous event, the physical return of Christ in power. But unless they utterly abandon their eschatologies of temporal defeat, they will remain unable to challenge Rifkin's earthly pessimism regarding mankind's temporal prospects. Those who hold pessimistic eschatologies already agree with him concerning the futility of social reform. See Appendix D. They share his pessimistic short-term eschatology. Remember the flyer cited on page 70 above. Quote, the creationist realizes that the world is growing old around him. He understands that things tend to run down, to age, to die. The creationist does not look for the world to improve, but to crumble slowly, as in erosion, decay, and aging. End quote. Christianity teaches that there is a covenantal curse, but that it is nevertheless possible to overcome many of the effects of this curse, in time and on earth, through covenantal faithfulness. God's covenant is man's primary constant. Thus, to the extent that Christians understand their faith and have confidence in the covenantal promises of God, they remain immune to Rifkin's theory of inescapable social pessimism. If they do not understand the ethical terms of the covenant and the promises of the covenant, then they remain vulnerable to his conclusions, or at least incapable of challenging him forthrightly. In summary, 1. Humanists are at war with time. 2. Christianity offers hope to individuals. 3. Rifkin has no legitimate hope to offer. 4. He adopts false optimism to gain converts. 5. He wavers between Eastern mysticism and the logic of science. 6. He says the West is about to be transformed by a new worldview. 7. He calls men to transcend themselves as humans. 8. In this appeal, he is clearly a New Age thinker. 9. Rifkin calls for metaphysical union with a monistic, impersonal God. 10. But how can man escape the death of nature? 11. Rifkin calls for zero growth. 12. He never mentions Christ's victory at Calvary. 13. There is no hope in the status quo if entropy governs the world. 14. He calls for a stalemate, Satan's old lie. 15. History is linear. 16. Scientists cannot find a way for mankind to escape oblivion. 17. Biblical optimism is based on God's progressive sanctification of the world. 18. Ethics is primary, not entropy. 19. God brings covenantal blessings on those who are faithful to Him. 20. Christianity must reject humanism's pessimism. 21. We can see real progress in history. 22. Victory is supposed to be a continuous process in history. 23. Growth is a Christian imperative. 24. All systems have a doctrine of final judgment. 25. Humanism's is the heat death of the universe. 26. This absolutizes history and the creation. 27. History will end on God's orders, not man's, and not entropy's.